Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Chloe McKee, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on the Brexit deal and what it means for the beef and lamb sector. Our presenter this evening is Luke Crossman, Senior Analyst within AHDB. Luke has worked for AHDB for over 6 years, previously working on dairy markets before moving to policy and Brexit. The plan of action is that Luke will run through a presentation and there will be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please type your question into the box on the side of your screens. I will then ask Luke your questions at the end of the presentation. Hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I will hand over to Luke.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar this evening. We were hoping when we booked this in that we'd be in a position to kind of have a Parliament vote on the deal, so we would know whether it's been accepted or not and what the next stages were. Unfortunately, as you would have seen, that's been delayed, likely to be till after Christmas now. So realistically, this is kind of just giving a bit of an update of what that potentially means, looking at it from a deal, what that would mean for beef and lamb, what a no deal would potentially mean as well, and just trying to get everyone up to date with where we are with Brexit. So the agenda of how we're going to look at this is a bit of where we are with Brexit at the moment, what happens in a deal, no deal, and then the potential impact to beef and lamb as well. So where are we now? You may have seen that we had the vote of no confidence put through the Conservative Party, which failed, and Theresa May is still the leader of the Conservative Party and still the leader of the country. She was in Brussels today to try and renegotiate some of the policy, the wording around the protocols in the withdrawal agreement, which I'll come on to in a bit, which is one of the main sticking points around the withdrawal agreement, it seems, overall. So the plan is over the next sort of few days and maybe a week or so, that will kind of get tidied up. We'll understand a bit more with whether or not anything will change and substantially. The kind of initial feeling is it might not, maybe a little bit of the wording will, and whether or not that will be enough to sway MPs who have previously said they were going to vote against it, we don't know yet. In terms of the new vote, like I said, it looks likely to be in the new year now. Unless anything dramatic happens, I can't see it being pushed forward. So we'll be continuously wait and see how that progresses. So in a deal scenario, we'll kind of talk through what that would happen if MPs were to pass that through. We would have this withdrawal agreement that would kick in. Now, in the withdrawal agreement, essentially the main thing is this 21-month transition period. Now, from the 30th of March, technically the UK would be a third country to the EU, but for all intents and purposes through this transition, we would still be a member of the EU. We just wouldn't have a vote or a say in what happens at the kind of Parliament level. But in terms of trade, in terms of all that other aspects, we'll be part of the European Union, so nothing really would necessarily change during that transition. We might see a few bits and pieces come into effect in terms of our own trade deals, as long as the EU signs off them, or little rules that we might be getting ready in place for when we officially kind of leave the European Union. Now, I mentioned about the protocols being one of the sticklers. So in that transition period, there's an option for extending it if both parties agree, which has to be put in place before July 2020. That can only be extended once. So the idea being that when future negotiations are being talked through, there's a bit of extra time for both sides to try and crack out a deal if they feel we're getting close to one. If we get to the end of the transition period and we haven't got a deal in place, then the protocols kick in. The main one being of interest from our point of view is the Northern Irish border and what might happen there. The protocol at the moment states that we would fall into essentially the UK being part of a singles customs territory with the EU. This would essentially be the EU single market. that we're currently involved in at the moment. So trade would be fairly frictionless, and there wouldn't be too much change in regulation. Northern Ireland would be under a bit more scrutiny under EU rules, being so tied to Ireland itself. And that's kind of where the issues have come from, if you haven't already seen. This view that politically it's kind of splitting up the UK a bit. And to a degree, there is that element because Northern Ireland would be treated slightly differently. And the other issue with the backstop is that at the moment, the wording suggests that this would be if this option does occur, it would be a continuous option until both parties agree a way out of it. So realistically, it's something that neither side has said that they want to happen. Both sides seem to want to agree, us and the EU agree a deal into the future relationship. But that backstop is there in case nothing does happen, so we don't end up with a hard border in Ireland. That wouldn't mean that we know anything more about life after Brexit. We would still be in a similar situation because future negotiations need to be agreed of how that would work. The withdrawal agreement was a 585-page document which looked at how we're going to exit the EU. A couple of days later, a future relationships framework document came out, which is 26 pages of where the kind of negotiations have been so far and how we're looking to progress with that. The main one for agriculture being we're looking to keep as free and frictionless trade as possible. So checks and those kind of things at the border they'll be probably increased from where they are now, but shouldn't be increased to a level that will affect trade and kind of make it very uncompetitive. Also keep tariffs down so they don't become an issue with what we're looking to do. That's still very much in the air. This transition period will allow negotiations to continue. So even though Brexit would have been achieved as such in us leaving the EU, we're not going to hear the end of all this kind of negotiations and discussions for quite a while to come, really, because there'll be, like I said, there'll be lots of negotiations still to take place and agreements put in place for life after this transition. So in a no-deal situation, there's so many options really of what could happen with this. The first one that I kind of want to look at is a vote of no confidence in a general election. Although we've had the vote of no confidence that was put through from the Conservative side of things, there is still the ability for MPs in the House of Commons to put a vote of no confidence through as well. Now, any MP can trigger this motion, and it would need a straight majority, essentially, of the MPs, or 2/3 majority, sorry, of the MPs to vote in favour of this. This would essentially mean that Theresa May would have to step down. There would be a time where we could see if any particular person or party can get enough of a majority in place to form a government. If not, we would go into a general election. Now, this, from a political point of view, doesn't seem like it will be an option in the next few days, purely because those MPs in Parliament want to see whether or not there will be any changes to the withdrawal agreement that Theresa May is trying to get in at the moment. So if she does come back with some changes, they could be sufficient enough to pass the deal through. If she doesn't, then that's where we might see a vote of no confidence put through the House of Commons, which potentially and most likely would trigger another general election. There is an issue with timeliness on this and all the other options as well, is that the 29th of March is essentially going to be our last day as EU members. The only way really that this would be able to take place is that if the EU was to agree an extension to Article 50. At the moment, they said they won't do that for any circumstance. But if it looks like one of the options might be for the UK to stay within the EU, then that might be where they would give a bit of grace on that. Another option would be a second referendum or a people's vote, slightly different in what they are. The second referendum would essentially just be like we had in 2016, a stay or leave. The people's vote could be more targeted. That will potentially, if that does come into fruition, will either be this deal that Theresa May has brought back, or whatever potentially gets revised, against no deal. And it could just be as simple as that the British public would vote on. Then whoever decides that might be the case that we go down, and if it does go to a people's vote, there could be a third option for staying in the EU altogether, which potentially could go against what a few MPs are saying at the moment in terms of the referendum itself. Said that even though it was a slim majority, the majority wanted to leave the European Union. Now, this option isn't likely at the moment because Theresa May has said herself that that's not anything that either option is not what she's looking for. So that would only really, in my mind, occur if either Theresa May was going to go to a people's vote and say it's this deal that she's negotiated or no deal, or if someone else was in power and decided that that's where they wanted to go. Again, there's a timeliness issue with Article 50. Not leaving has become more of an option, especially the last few days. The European Court of Justice voted that, or declared even, that the UK could actually withdraw the Article 50 and stay as a member of the EU and almost kind of forget what's happened over the past couple of years. Again, that doesn't seem to be an option under Theresa May, but someone else might look at triggering that if we were to get another government. And the kind of final option really of potentially what might happen is a hard Brexit. Now, a hard Brexit in kind of simple terms would be that on the 30th of March, we're no longer a member of the EU, so we would leave, and all sort of tariffs and things would have to be put in place from day one. Now, whether or not that would definitely happen on day one, or whether there would be a period of grace to try and get things kind of settled in, is very much up in the air. Both sides are kind of behind the scenes sort of preparing a little bit for a hard Brexit, but that's more in terms of business advice of what to do. In terms of what might happen at the borders, is still very much up in the air. And another option for a hard Brexit could be that we essentially buy in a membership extension. So we would say for another year, we would still be an EU member in all but name. So it would give both parties a chance to get whatever infrastructure and things they need to get in place for the following year, which then might implement a hard Brexit. So the only thing that really is certain at the moment that we kind of do know is about direct payments. And I'm sure you would have seen this before. It's been out for a little while. So the plan would be to phase direct payments out over a 7-year period from 2021. That being because the current cap budget has been agreed to 2020, regardless of what happens with Brexit. So even if we were to leave on the 30th of March 2019, we would still be in the cap situation as we currently are until 2020. That would be the last year of cap. So direct payments, the kind of first year has been essentially decided of what will happen to payments. So the first £30,000 of the pillar one, that direct payment will be reduced by 5%, and then so on and so forth through the various brackets. After that, we don't know how that will change. There's an option to extend that 7 years to 10 years if needed. So that could happen partway through that transition. There's an option for farmers to take lump sum of payments. How that will happen, we don't know. I would assume there has to be some sort of application process, and DEFRA will have to know how they're going to reduce payments to try and get hold of that. The other thing that we do know is that payments will be decoupled from farming, essentially, and that environmental payments are going to come a lot more forefront in the agricultural payments aspect of it. Now, the word public goods has been used quite a lot, looking at clean air, water, hedgerows, that sort of thing. But realistically, there's not a great level of detail of how this is going to happen. We know that sort of through 2019, 2020, there will be some sort of piloting systems starting to be developed before starting to be put in place a bit more in 2021 and so on. But realistically, because of the overhanging issue of Brexit and all that side of things is still ongoing, we don't envisage we're going to get a great deal more information on this for a little while to come yet, purely because we don't know what the actual future will show for Brexit itself. So for DEFRA to then start working on how this is going to change at the moment was it would be highly unlikely. So that's the kind of main gist of where we are a bit with Brexit and kind of the overall implications of what might happen with a deal and no deal from a parliamentary side of things. So now we'll kind of look at the potential impact for the beef and lamb sector. So first off, we'll look at from a trade point of view, just to get everyone up to scratch. I'm sure everyone's aware of where we are with this, but this is looking at trade from a beef side of things, exports and imports, and we can see that the EU is obviously very, very crucial for our beef exports, as it is for our sheep exports as well. But from the import side of things, we've got New Zealand and Australia in there as the big ones for that. It'd be quite interesting to see what Brexit deal is or isn't there, to how that would affect our imports from New Zealand and Australia. In a deal scenario, nothing really will change too much in the short term, but essentially we'd be then later on striking up our own trade deals with those countries. In a no deal scenario, we'd be pretty much doing that from day one. Now, there is a bit of an issue because we've got obviously currently part of the EU and we've got free trade agreements in place. What the EU and the UK want to do is look at proportioning those tariff-free quotas and other bits and pieces that we've got in place with these countries to kind of look at it from a trade point of view, so we can proportion them out between us and the EU. A number of countries have gone to WTO, the World Trade Organization, that looks after all of this aspect to try and keep trade fair, and aren't very happy with that solution. They basically want the same quotas in each because they feel they might be missing out. We don't fully know how that's going to work out just yet. It's one minute it seems like we'll be in a case where we have to take the full quota on. Another minute it seems that actually that would put us at an unfair position, so we wouldn't be able to do that. So I think at the moment is to kind of wait and see what happens with Brexit to see what might happen with that. But the kind of pattern of trade in a deal situation, won't change too much. But in a no deal situation, we could see it change a fair bit depending on the levels of tariffs and restrictions in place. I want to highlight a scenarios report that you may have seen that we produced October last year. Essentially, it was our first kind of look at what the potential implications could be of Brexit to agriculture. And we looked at 3 scenarios. We are looking at updating the work. We were hoping that we would have some sort of clear indication of where to go, and we might do that. We might get that early in the new year. So we're looking at firming this scenarios work up for a bit more of a timely approach. But there's 3 scenarios that we laid out originally are still relatively relevant to the current situation. Just a bit of background, we looked at 4 key aspects with this in terms of trade, policy, regulation, and labour, and they were the 4 main things that were fed into our previous scenarios, and they will be the same 4 things that will feed into our new scenarios as well. So the scenarios itself is the first one being is evolution. This is essentially, if we get the deal through, we'll have a free trade agreement with the EU. We don't envision anything to really change too much in the short term. So from this, looking at it from an initial impact, this would essentially be a deal option. Now, we've got on there that agricultural support would remain unchanged. We know that's going to change in the future. So what we're looking to do with the new stuff is to pick a moment in time so we can apply what that agricultural change might be at that moment in time to give it a bit more relevance to what it is. But that's the only thing we know is going to change from that evolution side of things. Now, the other 2 options that we had were unilateral liberalisation, which is essentially a no-deal scenario, but what we would do is reduce all our tariffs for our imports to zero to try and essentially, what from a government's point of view, keep food prices down. We would also see that agricultural support would come off 50%. That would be a reduction in Pillar 1 payments, the direct payments, and an increase in the environmental payments to come for an overall 50% reduction. And because of difficulties in a no deal situation, we would have a permanent labour cost rise. So the liberalisation one is essentially otherwise known as a bit of a cheap food policy, because we can't pick and choose. If under WTO rules, we can't pick and choose who we can lower tariffs through without having a formal agreement in place. So we would have to lower tariffs for everyone. Now, this is a bit extreme. This says that all tariffs would be reduced to zero. Now, what we know is going to happen, or potentially could happen under a no-deal scenario, is that the government could pick and choose certain products and certain tariffs to reduce. Whether they would go fully to zero, some products potentially, but more likely is that they would be reduced to close to zero, and it would be for key products that we import at the moment. Now, under this scenario, the EU wouldn't be able to reduce tariffs for us because they'd have to do it for everyone as well. So we would expect that full WTO tariffs would be put in place for our exports. Under Fortress UK would be the proper hard Brexit, where WTO tariffs would apply to everything. And for this scenario, we looked at a 75% reduction in agricultural support, and both permanent and seasonal labour costs would rise. Now, on the labour side of things, this assumes costs, but it doesn't assume availability, and that would be the potential issue for those two scenarios, because in a no-deal situation, what labour availability we might have is quite unknown. The government have released that they're going to pilot a seasonal worker scheme looking at bringing in 2,500 workers. When really we kind of know from industry commentary that it's probably more closer to 80,000 that we kind of need for agriculture. So there's going to be lots of challenges potentially under a no-deal situation to secure labour in the first place, let alone account for the potential increase in cost as well. So the work was done looking at farm business income. We use the farm business survey data because that's the best source of data we've got for this kind of level of analysis. So the green line at the top, this is for LFA, less favourable area beef and sheep. And the green line is the baseline for if nothing at all was going to change, this is where we would essentially be. Again, it's important to state that this is a sort of initial impact. This isn't what is going to continuously happen as such. This is what potentially could happen for that sort of first year or so under these scenarios. So in a evolution scenario, in a deal scenario, we would expect prices to fall a little bit because there would be an increase in trade cost because it wouldn't be a full customs union that we've got at the moment. Having a sort of free trade agreement would still mean there's a level of increased checks, but it's basically just admin checks at the border. The unilateral liberalisation we would expect to fall quite a bit for that, largely due to subsidies coming off, but also to do with trade implications as well, in terms of having imports coming in fairly cheap at no tariffs, and exports excuse me, being tariffs quite high. Now, for the Fortress UK, expected to be hit quite a lot because of essentially balancing issues within our own supply chain. So LFA is swayed more towards sheep, and sheep seems to be the sector that's potentially going to get hit hardest by a no deal scenario. Because essentially, well, you know, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we export a lot more of the bits that we don't necessarily use in the UK and want. So if we've got high tariffs in place, prices will have to come down quite a lot to satisfy some of that element of not being able to export product that we don't necessarily consume in the UK. So that would negatively affect prices quite a lot, and then obviously the reduction in farm payments as well would come into that scenario. So for lowland beef and sheep, this is swayed a bit more towards the beef side of things, and And as you can see, it's a similar picture, but the fortress is a little bit more favourable than the unilateral liberalisation, the cheap food policy one. But in the no deal scenario, the kind of hard Brexit aspect, some quite significant changes in that. Now, like I said, we are looking at updating this work so we can kind of firm up this element of it a bit more. And we'll be bringing that out sort of in the new year, sort of February, end of February, beginning of March time. Hopefully, although at the moment with Brexit, we've not known anything for quite a while, hopefully with more information in place so we can actually provide a lot more clarity than what we've been able to do so far. So just before we kind of come towards the end of this, I just want to touch on a few things that we're doing at the moment. This is our latest report, and it's looking at the characteristics of top performing farms. Now, we do lots of work, and other organisations do lots of work as well, looking at the kind of difference between the top 25 and the bottom 25 in terms of farm performance and statistics. Well, no one's really done too much work of looking at the characteristics of those top performers and why they are. So in collaboration with Anderson's, we came up with this report which kind of really delves into that. And it's not a teaching granny to suck eggs report. It's more of a just to kind of firm up understandings, to kind of open the mind a little bit, to see kind of where people are at the moment, where they kind of potentially want to be, and how this could kind of maybe focus the mind a bit more. So 8 key factors that this has kind of found out that the most of the top performers are doing, which is minimizing overheads, setting goals and budgets, benchmarking, understanding the markets, focusing on detail, mindset for innovation and change, continue people improvement, and specialization. Now, not everyone's going to be ticking all the boxes that are within this, and it's quite a big report, but there's what's been quoted to me by some farmers is that there's something for everyone in there, even if it's just firming up that what you're doing is kind of where you think you should be in terms of that comparing to other people. And then the kind of last bit of shameless self-promoting then really is that we've got so many Horizon series of documents, so many online tools and resources to hand to assist as much as possible in these kind of confusing times really with what's going on. And we'll continue with this offering in the future to try and look at various different elements of what's going on. And the website there is where we can find all this information, as well as the sector specific websites. So that's the presentation from my side of things. I appreciate it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and again, we were hoping that we would have more clearer information of where we were going with Brexit, but unfortunately, we can't control the government, so we don't know what will happen. Hopefully, maybe we can do another one of these in the new year when we should know a bit of a better direction. But I'll open it to the floor now for any questions at all.
Thanks, Luke. While I'm waiting for some questions to come up, I would like to remind you that the presentation has been recorded and will be available to watch back on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars from AHDB Beef and Lamb. So the first question is, in the scenario of a hard Brexit, will we see a dramatic drop in lamb price from day one? So will the market literally change overnight?
There'll be... I think it would change before that, to be honest, because we would know before day one of leaving the EU whether or not we would have a deal or not. So whether that be a month before the last kind of vote deadline really in the government is the 21st of January. So that would be the initial impact, because like we saw with the referendum, we would expect sterling to fall fairly sharply and probably become very close to, if not 1-to-1 with the euro, maybe slightly less than that. So that would be the initial impact to prices, how sterling would affect market prices. The later impact will be whether or not from the 30th of March we'll have to put tariffs in place, and we'll have to have lots of border checks, and how that will affect market prices, because one of the big things that's kind of a bit of an unknown at the moment is the non-tariff measures in terms of checks and but basically checks and any delays and things that might have, especially for food products, is the delay and then the deterioration of that product. So that will potentially have a knock-on effect as well. So we'd know before March if there's a deal or not, and we would know what the kind of first level of impact would be to market prices.
Thank you. Is it correct that vet medicines are regulated by the EU? And if so, are there implications post-Brexit for the UK?
Yeah, so at the moment they will be. The implications, from the implication side of things, there's been lots of kind of rumours that the government are stockpiling various medicines and stuff, and that's probably obviously going to be largely more for human population than necessarily the animal population. So getting access to some of those could potentially be a bit of an issue, depending on what sort of Brexit we have. In a no deal, that could be very challenging indeed. But chances are what would probably happen is that you'd be able to get the product in. It would just be what tariff would be put in place with that. I can't imagine our government would stray too far from what happens on the EU side of things. So we've seen with the agricultural bill, for example, we've basically said for most stuff, if not 90% of it, we're just going to copy the EU rules, and we've got the power to change them later on. So I think getting product in won't be too much of an issue. It'll be more sending product out under a no deal that'll be the issue.
Right, so following on from that, are there any products that we should be contingency planning for?
Any products?
Yeah.
I would probably suggest looking at where you get your feed from at the moment. If it's domestic, it probably wouldn't be too much of a problem. The kind of one of the benefits is that it's happening at a time where there should be lots of grass available for those herds, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue from an input side of things. But if you are feeding, I'd look at that being the main one really, is where you're buying it from at the moment. And if it's domestic, like I say, I don't think there'll be too many issues with that. But if it is imported feed, maybe that's something you want to look at, hedging your bets a little bit. Speak to your feed merchants on that side of things, and input costs in general really. If you're using a bit of fuel and you're running out, I'd probably get that in sooner rather than later. Fertilizer as well as another one really, just to not necessarily stockpile and go over the top with it, but to at least have a couple of months if you've got a lot of usage coming up in that sort of end of March, April, May time.
Thanks. And is there a document produced that will describe the potential impact on veterinary supplies?
We can certainly look at getting a bit more information out there if that's required. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't think we've got anything in particular to hand to be able to send out, but it's definitely something we can look at doing.
Next question. In a no-deal Brexit, are beef prices likely to rise short-term until trade deals are signed? And how long does it take to sign trade deals with third countries normally?
In terms of signing trade deals, they say it usually takes between 5 and 7 years. Agriculture being one of the stickling points with that. Now, in theory, because we've been part of the EU and we're not really going to stray too far from rules in the short term, it shouldn't take that long for us to do. But politically, things take a lot longer because people need their say, and we're not exactly dealing with one country. We'll be dealing with 27. So there's a chance that we could go into this transition period if we get a deal, and we'd need to extend it or go into a protocol to try and secure future relationships. There's also the chance that if we have no deal, as soon as the 30th of March comes in with no deal, we can start talking about a free trade deal with the EU, and that might take a couple of years. It might take the 5 to 7 years. So realistically, I would hope that we would be in a position, because we're under the rules at the moment, that we wouldn't take that long, but there is potential for it to take sort of that 5 to 7 years, as we've seen before. In terms of beef prices, it'd be a tough one to say really what exactly would happen. I think for all of agriculture in a no deal, initially the exchange rate would be the biggest impact of what would happen with prices. So depending on kind of trade flows and that aspect, then it would be determined whether it would fall or not. But essentially, supply and demand is still going to be key. If people need product, tariffs are another thing for traders and businesses to think about. They're not a massive barrier to trade as such. So it just depends on who's got the best supply and who needs the product, really, to how prices will vary over that time. So can't be too sure on that one, I'm afraid. But hopefully that helps at least.
Thanks. So we understand that abattoirs are struggling to fill their in-house vet roles. What are the implications if these roles are not filled, and does the government have a plan to rectify this?
I've kind of heard there are only rumours at the moment, so I haven't really got any full views on this, unfortunately. But it seems that there are enough, or there would be enough vets. They're just under different practices. So if the government were to certificate current vets for abattoir visits and at ports as well, then we've got enough people available at the moment to do that. It just means that they would have to pay domestic vets to maybe go on a course or something like that. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But if they don't go down that route and they want specific people that are under, under certain abattoirs or under certain roles that are in completely their control, then yes, that could be a big problem. The figure that's been quoted to me before is that around 75% of abattoir vets are from the EU. If there's complications with that and they're not able to stay, then yeah, that could be a serious implication. What the government are doing about it, to be honest, I don't know. We haven't really heard a great deal from the government at all about most things. So I'd hope that they'd be able to, look at the fact that we could pay local vets, domestic vets who are qualified enough to do that, and maybe do a couple of courses to make sure they're up to speed of what's needed to be done. Whether we go down that route is still remains to be seen.
Thanks, Luke. So in terms of a reduced subsidy and potentially reduced income for produce under 2 out of 3 scenarios, the best farms will obviously budget and plan ahead. How do we best plan for the future, especially in the tenant sector, where rents are rising and FBT rents are under a 3-year review? And can you see rental levels coming down in value under a no deal?
The best way to budget and kind of plan for that now is to essentially look at your accounts without agricultural support in terms of direct payments. I'd probably say if you get environmental payments, don't look at trying to increase that and to see how it'll be offset, because I just don't think it's worth that at the moment, because we really don't know what's happening. But in terms of direct payments, I'd take those out of the accounts now, look at how the business would shape without them, and then look at kind of, the farm as a whole, the farm businesses as a whole, whether you diversify or not, and see kind of what level of how that would impact your finances. So what you might need to think about doing, whether you would need to look at maybe more diversification, maybe look at joint ventures with other people as well, whether that would be an option. That would be the kind of the planning that I would be looking at doing now, attending as many meetings and things as well, to just try and firm up as much information as possible is crucial to that, in my mind, to understand as best you can, although there's lots of uncertainties, what the kind of certainties are and what is out there. In terms of rents, it's a tricky one, really, because some people believe that rent values are quite heavily linked to direct payments. Other people don't. If in a no deal scenario, there's been some reports that land values themselves would drop sort of 30%. What the knock-on effect would be to rent values is a tricky one, really. It's probably going to be very much in a supply and demand scenario, whereas if there's lots of people looking to rent land, then they're not going to change a great deal. If it puts it to a place where no one, the land you renting at the moment, if no one else is going for it, then you'd be able to negotiate on what would be on paper a better deal in terms of a cheaper rent. But I think it would be very much more that if you're looking for land and there's lots of competition, then they would probably hold quite well. But if land falls 30% or whatever some people are potentially expecting under a no deal, then rent values would probably have to come down to match that to a degree, but they might be supported a bit more by that demand if it is there.
Thank you. If we end up with a no deal and we then have to renegotiate individual products, wouldn't that work in our favour, and would we be able to cut the lamb imports?
Potentially. In theory, that could work as long as when we're looking at trade deals, we get the best for agriculture. The trouble is they tend to come when you're looking at trade deals with people, you tend to look at everything that you can offer each other as such. So from an EU point of view, they would still want lots of our agricultural products and to provide products to our market. From a UK government point of view, is agriculture the top priority? Arguably not. So there's potential that we may sacrifice agriculture in a future trade deal with the EU to get a better deal elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen or it's definitely an approach from government. I'm just saying that's a risk with that approach, is that we might offset certain products with getting perceived better deals with other products. So while in theory we could negotiate a better trade deal leaving the EU with no deal at all, there is the other option that actually it could make it worse for agriculture in that scenario. But either one is possible. I wouldn't have a clue which way they would go down at the moment, though.
Thanks. And what about the costs of imported machinery and tyres, etc., that are imported? Would a no deal mean potential tariffs on these items as well?
There are tariffs to machinery. They're not massive though. They don't have a big implication from what I've seen to the overall price. I don't know about tyres, I'm afraid, but the biggest potential change from that side of things would probably be the tax. We haven't fully kind of looked into how that would shape up, but I don't think tariffs would be the problem. I think it would more likely be tax that might be the issue on that, because obviously we're part of the VAT is basically in line with Europe, and lots of our products kind of work in a shared way, so that would have to change. And kind of what I've heard and seen so far, that would be more of an issue, but it's something that we need to look into a bit more detail on, of how that might shape out, because like I said, I don't think the tariffs would be too much of a problem from what I've seen. I think it would be that side of it, but how much that would increase by, unfortunately I don't know off the top of my head.
Thanks, Luke. If a trade border evolves in the Irish Sea, distorting trade with Northern Ireland, what might the implications be on British beef prices?
It's a very tough one, because theoretically, if a trade border, sorry, I took that to be a hard border, but that won't necessarily happen. But if a trade border occurs, then it depends on what the border's there for. If we've got a bit of a trade deal and it's kind of as frictionless as possible, that's basically just going to put a bit of admin costs on there, so it would support domestic prices a bit. If it's full tariffs, then depending on how much we can displace, would be where prices would go. So if we could displace quite a lot of it, prices could be supported quite well, but there's still going to be elements that we would need to export, which would bring the overall sort of carcass price down a bit. So it's very, very up in the air, and it would largely be on that element really of how much we can satisfy what we currently import for our own production, and what value we'll be able to get for the stuff that we basically don't want here and can't use here, that we would need to still export.
Thanks. Does a no deal have to be approved by the House of Commons? So can the House of Commons vote against a no deal, or is it a default situation?
It's it's a tricky one. They would have to approve it, but essentially there's no if there's no other options, we would crash out, to use the term. So an orderly no deal would be that we would put through the House of Commons that we would have a no deal, and we would all be accepting the fact we have a no deal. If they didn't put it through, but they didn't put the deal through, we didn't pull Article 50, we didn't have another, all those other options I talked about earlier, we would essentially crash out without a deal. So technically it would need to be approved, but even if it wasn't approved, it is still an option.
Thanks. And how can we control the quality of food products coming in without jeopardizing the trade of other industries? For example, food from the USA produced to different standards to our own. What are the chances of stopping imports of food produced to standards lower than our own and cheapening our own produce?
Not great on our own, to be honest, because under WTO rules, that's not really, if it's something that's not affecting the sort of food quality from a human consumption point of view, it's not something you can prevent coming in. Us as the EU at the moment are able to do it because it's a bit of a sort of power entity, really, not upsetting too many people under WTO. Trade talks with lots of countries are going pretty well, so no one's really complained too much. The worry from from our point of view and the EU's point of view is if we leave, is that we would get the likes of America and potentially Brazil and Thailand and others that would say, well, you can't stop our products coming in because they're safe to eat. And then they would potentially knock that onto the EU and challenge them at that level. But for us, there's nothing really stopping them coming in apart from consumers, really. If consumers want to buy, if as long as they're educated in the right way and they want to buy top quality products that haven't been chlorinated, treated, or injected with hormones, then they'll know which ones to pick out, essentially. But realistically, there's no real barriers to stopping them coming in apart from education and consumers' preference.
Thanks. Do you think in a post-Brexit world, the UK government will facilitate the industry to progress technologies such as gene editing? And if so, how might this affect trade with the EU?
There's potential for that. There's been lots of talk from us being at EU meetings, and what we might do post EU is we want to be a science-based country, and that's something that sometimes doesn't happen so much on the EU side of things, as I'm sure most people have been aware with certain bits and pieces. But we can embrace all that stuff if we were to leave, because it would be under our control if we were to do so. In terms of trading with the EU, though, that might throw a spanner in the works, and certain products would probably still be able to be traded because the traceability would be and is pretty high. So we could see, what animals have been feeding on GM fodder and non-GM fodder. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem. But the overall nervousness of the EU, or at least a large proportion of the EU countries around GM and genetic editing, all that sort of stuff, would potentially throw a big spanner in the works. Although, like I mentioned, with the EU side, with the kind of US and other products coming in with a different quality level, if it's actually fit for consumption at a human level, we could potentially do it and then put a case to WTO to say that actually they shouldn't be able to stop us bringing product in. But it's a bit of a grey area, really, of one, whether we would do it, and two, would the EU be able to stop us, and how we'd be able to fight that.
Thanks. How will research be affected by leaving the EU? Will it significantly reduce access to funding for agricultural research?
We wouldn't be part of the kind of funding group that we are at the moment. It's a difficult one to say because I'm not involved in it, but from my point of view, we do lots of research products projects with countries that aren't part of the EU anyway. We still do all that sort of stuff. So I think it could affect the funding a bit for projects being led by the UK in terms of EU funding, but it shouldn't stop us being involved with them, or at least using the benefits for them. Lots of research that comes out of various countries is freely available online and used by other countries to either compile further research into areas or to basically piggyback on. So I think it might stop us being heavily involved with certain projects, but it won't necessarily stop us getting the benefits of those projects. It just could be that it's a bit later on down the line than maybe it is now. But that's a bit of a layman's talk of it, to be honest. I don't know fully how it would be affected. That's just my take on it.
And the last question is, do you know what the effect on organic price would be under the 3 scenarios? Would it move at all or not?
It would probably have to move in line with other prices. There's only so much premium it will be able to maintain. So in scenarios where prices are going up, it in theory should boost the premium a bit, assuming that those through the supply chain and consumers would be willing to pay whatever level it increased to from it. If prices were to fall quite a bit, then organic wouldn't see the initial impact, I wouldn't have thought. But it would all depend on the end consumer. If the end consumer is willing to pay whatever price it is, then there's no reason why it should fall greatly, apart from other issues like the overall price from a farmer's point of view might change, because certain cuts might still be high demand from an organic point of view, but other cuts that would go into the kind of normal supply chain, if you like, or the conventional supply chain even, would potentially bring the overall price that the individual farmer gets. But through the supply chain, organics potentially could keep relatively well if consumers are still wanting to pay the premium prices on the shelves. But with a no-deal situation, it would seem that there's potential for consumers to have less money in their pocket. So would they want to buy organic products in the first place? And we've seen that when the economy changes, consumers' mentality and sort of principles as well tend to change a little bit. So again, it's a bit of a woolly answer, I'm afraid, but that's the kind of best I can do with that one.
Thanks very much. So that's all of the questions. Thanks for that brilliant presentation, and thanks to everybody for listening. I'd like to remind you all that the presentation has been recorded and will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars should you want to revisit it. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be emailed shortly in case you need to recap on anything heard tonight. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everyone.